Next, we'd like to welcome Dr. Taylor. Dr. Valerie Taylor is a professor and head of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Calgary and Departmental Science Advisor for Health Canada. She completed medical school at Memorial University of Newfoundland, woohoo, followed by psychiatry residency and PhD in neuroscience. A postdoctoral fellowship at McMaster University then followed. She holds multiple certifications, including a Rotman Advanced Health Leadership Diploma and Harvard Behavior Economics Program. Named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women in STEM in 2020. Woohoo! Her research focuses on medical psychiatry and the gut-brain axis. She leads clinical trials on microbiome-based treatments for mood disorders and oversees North America's largest neuroscience microbiome repository. With over 200 peer-reviewed publications, Dr. Taylor has received national and international funding. She also serves on boards including Kids Help Phone and Brain Canada and is CEO of Taylor Biotherapeutics. Welcome to the podium, Dr. Taylor. So you advance your slides, you press the green.
Green, go.
And then you pull this, if you want to use this, pull it closer to your mouth.
Perfect.
You can use this one.
I can handle that, thank you.
Graduate memorial as well. Yes, I'm from St. John's.
Fellow Newfoundlanders here, just connecting for the first time.
Do you want this one?
I can use this, I think. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. We're going to talk about a rare issue in a rare issue. So there's not a lot of evidence specifically around the gut microbiome and anything from a mental health perspective, but specifically PANS PANDAS. This is really just an emerging field, and we're really excited to be sort of at the beginning of what I hope is going to offer some really interesting options as we move forward. So very quickly, just most of my conflicts were mentioned in the introduction. And what we're going to talk about today is just, if nothing else, I'm going to give you some interesting tidbits that you can go home and talk to your family about, but hopefully also get you excited about the art of the possible with respect to understanding, what's occurring in the microbiome, mental health, OCD, PANS, PANDAS space. So very quickly, before we get into just talking about more of the PANS PANDAS work, just to give you some fun facts, as my kids like to say, about that gut microbiome. So you all have 100 trillion different bacteria in and on you. So that's kind of creepy, isn't it? Yeah, I know. In terms of genetic material, so your bacterial genetic material outnumbers your human genetic material about 150 to 1. And you have 1.3 times more bacterial cells than human cells in your body. If you actually kind of weighed your genetic material, it weighs about 2 kilograms. If we were able to take every bacteria in us, out of us, and kind of line it up, it would actually travel around the world 2.5 times. And so you can see that if you think about this too much, you start to wonder who's actually in charge of what we're doing. Is it us or is it our bacteria? The thing that's most exciting for me is that your gut microbiome, the bacteria within us, is accessible and therefore modifiable, which allows some interesting possibilities when we think about just treatment opportunities. And so just to give you a little bit of background on why we're doing this strange, what seems like to many strange area of research. Now, when we got into this space, I quickly realized that this was actually, and we heard a little bit about this from our previous great speaker who talked a little bit about the history of things. So the initial original way in which people understood mental illness was that it was actually caused by toxins in your body. So that was originally how mental illness was conceptualized. It was something that people called autointoxication or intestinal toxemia, that all illnesses, so melancholia, which was the word for depression, hysteria, which was used to describe anxiety, especially in women, all of these things were thought to be caused by bacterial toxins. And it was hypothesized that if you could change up these toxins, people would get better. And so one of the ways that people did that was through the consumption of specific foods. And so one of the ways that they first did that was that very affluent, well-to-do individuals would go to these places called sanatoriums. And there's a picture of a book that was published by the most famous of these sanatoriums called Battle Creek Sanatorium. And you can see that this book was written by Dr. J.H. Kellogg. And Dr. Kellogg is probably, you guys are maybe familiar with him from some of the foods you ate this morning. So he is of the Kellogg's family. And he created at Battle Creek Sanatorium, they would give people things like bran, for example, as a way to change up their intestinal composition. Now, nobody had any idea that we're talking about gut bacteria. This is like, in 1880, 1910. We didn't know about bacteria and things. We just knew that when people ate differently, suddenly they felt differently from a mood perspective. And so you can see that that actually led to, among other things, the Kellogg's cereal empire. And it's actually quite funny that this is one of the first places in which the commercialization of products occurred, because one of the things that they did at Battle Creek Sanatorium was prepare these different foods. And Dr. Kellogg was the physician there, and his brother was the accountant. And the accountant was obviously interested in things that accountants are interested in, and he wanted to make money, and he said, you know what's missing in bran? And that's sugar. Gonna make a mint if you... And so Dr. Kellogg said, nope, we're focused on the bran. The accountant Kellogg said, I'm gonna start my own company, and Frosted Flakes and all the things were born. So it was quite interesting that around that same time, people started looking at other ways in which to change up your gut bacteria. And in France at this time, there was a gentleman who noticed that there were certain bacteria that prevented milk from spoiling and cheese from spoiling. And he thought that this actually might be really helpful to prevent these toxic processes in humans from occurring. And so he mass-produced the compounds that kept the milk from spoiling. And interestingly, that was a bacteria called lactobacillus. And so he basically produced the world's first probiotics. And if you go to a drugstore now, most of the probiotics are still lactobacillus. And so that sort of started something, that 120 years ago, we knew that things like probiotics could actually help improve mood. But of course, as sometimes happens in these spaces, things went a little bit too far. And so people thought, okay, if you gave somebody a probiotic, or if you give them bran and that changes how their intestinal system works and they feel better, then if you actually remove their entire intestinal system, that they'll probably feel great. And so and so they called these processes psychosurgeries. And so you can imagine if you tried to remove the GI system of somebody with schizophrenia in 1890 who really didn't want to have their GI system removed, it was a pretty high mortality rate. And so these things didn't go very well. And at the same time, people were selling all of these really strange contraptions. This is an ad for something that was called the JBL Cascade, and JBL stands for Joy, Beauty, Love, and it's basically a home enema system. So it is probably, I don't even want to know what went into the naming or the idea that this is what this should be named. But of course, these things made people think that there's a lot of nonsense occurring within this space. And then at the same time, in Europe, we had the first psychiatric drugs started to be developed, and chlorpromazine, which is an older antipsychotic, was the first one that was developed. And that really made the field move away from this concept of intestinal toxemia into what is still predominantly kind of accepted, I think, as the explanation for most mental illness, which is the monoamine hypothesis, which is basically mental illnesses due to an imbalance of neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and that if you use drugs to regulate these imbalances, that people are going to feel better. And so that started, and it still continues. But I think now, in part because we have better technology, and so now we know we're not just talking about intestinal toxins. People can actually look at what's in your gut and the bacteria that are there and understand what they do and visualize what happens with different treatments, that people are starting to embrace this whole area of your gut microbiome as actually playing a pivotal role again, and starting to move away from this concept of brain neurotransmitters and psychiatric medications. And I think that that's pretty exciting. And this actually is, super relevant to the PANS PANDAS field, because we have actually in this space one of the few examples of a psychiatric diagnosis that's actually linked to an infection. So I think that, people in this space were kind of onto this way earlier, and I think it's pretty interesting that the science is now starting to catch up to some of this stuff. So when we think about just the reasons why we feel that your GI system and your brain are linked, so I'm going to take you through just a little bit of this science. And so one of the reasons that we think people develop mental illness is because of an imbalance, or one of the hypothesized reasons is an imbalance in neurotransmitters. And so, if you have depression, people assume that the main issue is there's a decrease in serotonin. Most psychiatric drugs, most psychotherapies are designed to increase this serotonin. And we think that serotonin in your brain is the target. But you actually have more serotonin receptors in your GI system than you do in your brain. And we know that most bacteria in your GI system either produce these neurotransmitters or break them down. And so maybe it's not actually just the neurotransmitters in your brain, but it's more about what's happening within your GI system and these bacteria that are actually having a role. We know there's the concept of cortisol and inflammation, which have been touched on by some of the earlier speakers. And so we heard about the stress response earlier. So when you see that bear, one of the things that happens is that your body produces cortisol. So that's supposed to happen because it's supposed to make you focus on mobilizing everything responsible for the stress response, getting you out of a stressful situation. Once that stressful situation has, gone, then your cortisol is supposed to go back down again. But we know that for some people, the cortisol goes up too high or it doesn't come down in the same time frame as it does for others. And we think that that's part of what is contributing to the development of mental illness. One of the other things, and you were asked about, some of the things that happen in stress, and you sweat and things. One of the other, I almost spoke up, but one of the things that many of you probably relate to is that when you get stressed, your GI system goes off. Like lots of people get just, butterflies in their tummy, they get a tightness, they get diarrhea. That's pretty common. And it's interesting because one of the things cortisol does is that it makes the kind of tight junctions between the cells in your GI system just get a little bit looser. And maybe some of you have heard about the word or the phrase leaky gut syndrome. And so things get out of your GI system, bacteria gets out of your GI system that probably shouldn't. And of course, what happens then is that your body immediately starts an inflammatory response because suddenly there's stuff in your bloodstream that shouldn't be there. This triggers this inflammatory cascade. And we know that inflammation is neurotoxic, prolonged inflammation, and can really result in lots of downstream problems in terms of just cognition and brain functioning. One of the other, and all of these things, are very, very relevant, I think, probably to the PANS PANDAS space more than anything else, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. Another thing that happens is we know that when you all eat the lovely lunch that we had today, the bacteria, the good bacteria in your GI system breaks down the food that you eat into things that your body needs. And some of these breakdown products are called short-chain fatty acids. And short-chain fatty acids are really important for lots of things, including brain growth. And so you can then imagine if you have bacteria in your GI system that either don't break down the short-chain fatty acids, and you have a lot of them, or that prevent other bacteria from breaking down short-chain fatty acids. So if you happen to have that bacterial profile, suddenly you're not going to produce as much of these short-chain fatty acids, and it's going to lead to downstream problems. Another explanation is that we actually have this direct connection between your GI system and your brain. It's called the vagus nerve, and it's like this big highway that goes kind of from your stomach up into your brain. And people realized that that was actually important when, before we had antibiotics to treat peptic ulcer disease. And again, I think that that's worth noting, that we do have other examples of physical illnesses that are caused by bacteria, that when people started talking about the fact that ulcers were actually caused by specific bacteria, H. pylori, and that you had to take treatment for this bacteria to prevent ulcers, it took a long time for the medical community to come around to accepting that that was actually a thing. And before we actually understood that, to treat peptic ulcer disease, people would cut your vagus nerve, because one of the things the vagus does is causes acid production in your stomach. So if you cut the vagus nerve, you're not going to have acid production in your stomach. It would be helpful for peptic ulcer disease. But what they also found was that when you cut the vagus nerve, you didn't get acid production, but suddenly you had people developing psychiatric illnesses that never had problems with psychiatric illnesses before. So there was something about that connection that was really important between your GI system and your brain. And I think all of these things really started to make people think about that the role of bacteria in the development of brain, what we originally conceptualized as just a brain-based illness, was really something that had merit and was worth looking into a little bit further. And so I'm going to just give you a couple quick education lesson. I am not a teacher like some of the other speakers, but I'll just do my best so that you understand what we're talking about and why these things are important. So when we talk about microbial diversity, people use terms like alpha diversity and beta diversity. And basically that means, what kinds of bacteria are in a sample, and then beta diversity means how different are the samples. So think of it of, how many Joneses are in a particular sample, and then how many Joneses versus Smiths are in a particular sample, to kind of describe what we're seeing. We talk about something called the Shannon index, which is basically how many different types of bacteria are there and how are they distributed. So there's Joneses, there's Smiths, there's Cooks, there's Taylors, and they're all spread apart. That's what we think about when we talk about how we look at bacteria. And then we think about and we talk about another term called the Bray-Curtis dissimilarity, which is basically how you compare two different samples. And one of the things that we know is very important across all illnesses, both mental health but physical health, is that a diverse population, so lots of diversity, is healthy. And as diversity starts to diminish, when there's less different types of bacteria, that's usually associated with illness, physical illness, mental illness. And that's something that we're going to see really plays out in the OCD and PANS PANDAS space as well, when people have done some research looking at that. But basically, from a OCD perspective, because most of the evidence kind of comes from the OCD space, and there's actually only been, so far, I think, 2 studies thus far directly looking at the gut microbiome and PANS PANDAS, but they've all been in the last couple of years, so I think that we're going to start to see more coming soon. But essentially, what people have thought is that there's either this direct trigger from diet, drugs, antibiotics, or some indirect trigger from trauma, stress, a different type of root, that actually creates something called gut dysbiosis. And basically what gut dysbiosis means is that you've changed up in a way that's not healthy the different bacteria that are in your GI system. And of course, this gut dysbiosis then causes problems either with genetic factors, with immunological factors, or with different kinds of structural changes, and that these things all interact with one another and result in the end with, in this case, brain changes, mental illness, and then subsequently behavioral changes that are associated with those symptoms. And so we know that the role of inflammation in PANS PANDAS is really linked to, in these little red dots, those are what strep bacteria look like. And so the evidence suggests that in these cases, strep infections start to alter the composition of your gut bacteria, that suddenly this starts to move the pattern in a way that's not associated with wellness, and that this leads to either a persistent inflammatory state or these inflammatory peaks that are way higher than they should be, and this indirectly alters brain function and then behavior. So and I mentioned there's only been a couple studies, but they're interesting. So there was a study that looked at 30 children that had a diagnosis of either PANS or PANDAS. They didn't separate it out, they looked at both, and they compared their gut bacteria to those of controls that didn't have these diagnoses. And what they found was that there was a significant increase in certain bacteria in the Bacteroides family, and that there was a decrease in bacteria in the Firmicutes family. That's interesting because the Bacteroides bacteria actually are associated with increased inflammation, and they have a role in inactivating certain antibiotics, which was, I thought, pretty cool. And so it's going to make certain antibiotic treatments not work so well. So these bacteria and these changes were also really involved in processes like short-chain fatty acid production. And so suddenly you're going to get less of these short-chain fatty acids that are really important for brain development. And we also know that when short-chain fatty acid production is decreased, that inflammation can worsen. We also know that antibodies produced in response to a strep A infection are going to alter the composition of your gut microbiome. And so that is going to also impact then how those bacteria impact just short-chain fatty acid production, inflammation, and interestingly, there's also some research to show that certain types of bacterial changes in your GI system influence how psychiatric medications are metabolized. And so if you get an infection that changes your gut microbiome, you might suddenly develop a type of gut profile that are going to make psychiatric drugs not work so well, which means that for some people, for a period of time, they're simply, taking these drugs are kind of like eating Smarties. It's kind of like if you measure the level of drug in a person's system, it's not readable. It just seems like the drugs aren't being metabolized because many of the psychiatric drugs, especially the antidepressants, the SSRIs, are metabolized in your GI system. And so you have antidepressants that don't work as well, or you have antibiotics that are either not going to work so well or not going to do what you want them to do. Some of the other results of that study also showed that prolonged antibiotic use can cause this dysbiosis. And so antibiotics as treatments are really important, but they have to be given and monitored so that you're not actually, if they're given too long, actually seeing a worsening of symptoms or creating other problems. And there's also been some interesting research to show that maybe antibiotics need to be given paired with things like probiotics or prebiotics, other things that are going to help maintain your gut integrity. So in terms of gut microbiome treatment strategies, I think some of the things that have been recommended, now most of these things are very, very still in the research space, but I think that they've been brought up in the course of other talks for other pieces. People recommend a anti-inflammatory diet pattern. Now, there's no magic kind of diet. I think what anti-inflammatory, people would talk about a Mediterranean diet as being an example of that, but there's lots of ways to eat, and it's considered an anti-inflammatory diet. I think one of the things to avoid is a very Western processed food kind of diet when at all possible. Increase fiber intake, because that makes the bacteria that make your short-chain fatty acids happy, and then a potential role for pre and postbiotics. Now, all of this stuff is what the evidence has suggested may be helpful as a way to just make your gut microbiome happy. Is this going to have an impact on any psychiatric symptoms? We don't know. That is still, this is, as I say, this is a rare space in a rare space. But I think if we're looking for do no harm types of things, that these are things that I think can be implemented, and we know hopefully it shouldn't make anything worse. There's also been some real interesting evidence just about the use of probiotics in individuals with OCD, and what they have shown is that they have significantly changed the gut microbiome profile, moving it from a composition that is really pro-inflammatory to one that is anti-inflammatory, because these bacteria produce all kinds of inflammatory markers and things. And so again, is that actually going to have an impact on symptoms? People simply haven't started to do that work yet in the OCD space, and definitely not in the PANS PANDAS space. But I think that as the body of evidence grows to show that, first we have to show that the microbiome is different in these two conditions, and we know now that it is. And so the next step will be to look at, do things that change your gut microbiome actually also improve symptomatically some of the symptoms of these illnesses. And so I think, there was a review paper that was done, and this is kind of a figure that looks at kind of all of those pieces in terms of PANS PANDAS and how the gut microbiome really plays a role in potentially impacting, if not the onset of symptoms, but perhaps some of the exacerbation of symptoms, and how trying to modify and change the gut microbiome may actually result in symptomatic improvement. So I think it really shows that this is an area that is really ripe for investigation, and that we hope things are going to be able to come from just starting to look in this space that can really make a difference and give individuals just one more option from which to choose treatments from. Now, one of the things that got my group in my lab, and I think some of you have seen some of the students from my lab who've been here for the last couple days, one of the things that got us really interested in the work we do was some wild kind of animal studies where people looked at, they took these types of mice called germ-free mice. And basically, germ-free mice are mice that don't have their own immune system. So they're kind of raised in these very secure environments because they don't have an immune system. And they took stool from humans, not from other mice, but they took stool from humans, and they inoculated these germ-free mice. And what they found was if you took stool from individuals that had depression, the mice started to show depressive-like behaviors. They suddenly didn't want to eat, they didn't want to socialize, they just wanted to sleep a lot of the time. If you took stool from individuals that had anxiety, that these mice started to show anxiety-like behaviors. They actually were able to do it even with autism. And suddenly the mice started to show that their patterns of social interaction completely changed. With OCD, they were able to provide examples of repetitive behaviors that manifested in these mice. And so that really, to me, was quite provocative because it showed that there was a infectious vector, which is kind of what many in the PANS PANDAS community already knew could potentially be a cause of illness. But for the first time, people were able to show it for other mental illnesses, that there was something that you could transfer that would cause a mental illness. And so we got excited because if you could cause illness by transferring, specific bacteria from one organism to another, we wanted to look at if you could actually treat illness by doing the same thing. If people already had an illness, could you change up the bacteria that were in their GI system and actually make them better? And so that was some of the stuff that we got really interested in. At the time we started, the only work done in this space, the fecal transplant space, looked at individuals with autism. And this was just more luck because people had looked at fecal transplant in autism simply because a number of children with autism also have GI problems, either constipation or diarrhea. And so they thought, okay, maybe fecal transplant can help with these GI symptoms. And simply as an afterthought, they kind of figured, okay, if we're going to do this work, we might as well see what happens to, symptoms of an autism diagnosis as well. I don't think anybody actually thought that that needle was going to move much, but they were actually quite shocked to find that, both symptoms of GI illness, and the first graph, graph A, looks at individuals with their GI symptoms. Graph B looks at the autism symptoms, and it just looks at it over kind of the first 8 weeks and then over 2 years, because that's how long they followed these kids up. And not surprisingly, the GI symptoms improved, but so too did the autism symptoms. So much so that, the red bar represents the individuals who have a clinical diagnosis in graph B of autism at the start of the study. And then you can see at the 2-year mark, the number of children still reaching kind of threshold to give a DSM diagnosis of autism had actually decreased. And some of the kids no longer met criteria to actually have an autism diagnosis anymore. Now, this was a small study. It was only 18 people. It's called an open label study. So everybody knew what they were getting. It wasn't randomized. And so there's always a little bit of an effect. When people know they're getting something, they really want it to work, that sometimes you see a bit more of a positive response. But still, I think it was really exciting for people. And there's subsequently, this group has done a second study that is larger and is randomized. So some got treatment, some got placebo. They didn't know who got what. And they've been able to show similar results, that fecal transplant seems to have an impact on the symptoms of autism. And so we know, when we started, we had this information to go by. And so we started, for us, our first trial of fecal transplant was for bipolar disorder. And that was the one that got us, the one that we're furthest along, and we'll talk about those results. And then we started a study for major depression, and then more recently for OCD, and I'm going to talk about the OCD results. And hopefully later on this year, we're going to actually start a pediatric study. So these are all in adults. We're going to start a pediatric study looking at attention deficit disorder and the role of fecal transplant as a way to treat the ADHD. So we're sort of excited about that. But very quickly, fecal transplant is kind of exactly what you think it is. We get donors who donate, who are super healthy. Kind of think about the same criteria you have to have in order to donate blood, and then add about 4 extra pages of it. So for us, for us, because we're looking at fecal transplant for mental illness, along with all of the criteria that you would have to show for a blood donation, we also have to show that our donors don't have any mental illness, nor are there any diagnoses of mental illness in first-degree relatives. And so you can imagine now how many families have no mental, we all have that aunt, right? And so it's very, and some of us are that aunt. And that's okay. That makes us the fun aunt. I'm okay with that. But so when we find our donors, we treat them very well because there's not a lot of them. Okay, you guys are just the best. I feel like really happy about the work that we're doing now. So essentially, this field has come from sitting in a sanatorium eating bran to treat auto-intoxication to actually producing precision, custom-targeted probiotics that are actually specific to treating specific illnesses. And I know that we talked about this treatment paradigm and people have seen the triangle come up. And so we know that we do have options for treatment of some of these illnesses, but we need more. And we are hoping that the work that we're doing is going to really help push this field forward so that we have other treatment options. There's never going to be one thing is magic, but I think the more options that we have that are going to be tolerable, especially for kids, and that are really going to help providers and parents have the opportunity to help their families, the better. And so that's why I'm really grateful that you guys invited me here to talk today. We are still, I gotta have a shout out, we're still recruiting for our depression study and our OCD study. And so if anybody feels that they might qualify, again, just Google fecal transplant, University of Calgary. Nobody else is doing that but us, so you're gonna find us. You all find us. And so please, if you're interested in being part of the biobank, you're interested in, if you know about, you think you might want to participate in the studies, you have a friend or family member you think might be interested, please send them along. Or connect with Amit or Nicole. Now, Nicole, you stand up too. You're not going to get away. And Nicole is helping coordinate recruitment for the clinical trials as well. So please feel free to reach out to either one of them. They know more about this stuff than I do at this point, and really lucky to have them. So I'm really lucky that you guys asked me to come and talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I apologize, I kind of lost track, so I don't know how much time we have, but if we don't get questions today, I always say very angry, psychotic people can find my email online, and so I am fairly certain that you guys can as well. So please feel free to send me an email if you have questions.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. You've got a convert here. Would you mind taking some questions?
Oh, not at all. I'm happy to.
Okay, so I'm going to do the online ones first. So how can we support the gut when the child has restrictive eating, only eating carbs, junk, and sugary foods?
Yeah, and you know what? I will say that is absolutely a huge, huge challenge, and I will acknowledge it as a challenge. I am not the person to give you advice on that. So I will say what you do is you find a really, really talented dietitian, and there are some excellent ones, nutritionists, that can help give you some advice on this. And I'm gonna stay in my lane. I think that there's different kinds, it depends on what the restrictive eating is like, and there are, different ways in which food can be formulated, from smoothies to many other things, but I also understand that that does not cut it for some of the types of restrictive eating behaviors, and so I would talk to somebody who knows much more about it than I do, which would be to talk to a really well-trained nutritionist or dietitian who has, sometimes naturopaths have some expertise in this space. And so I'm not the person to ask, but I acknowledge that the struggle is real. I have a picky eater, restrictive eater myself, so I get it.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is there a probiotic stroke food supplement that is more successful for children with PANS PANDAS?
Yeah, and again, I think that, we actually have a paper that's going to come out pretty quickly that is just making recommendations more in the depression and bipolar space, because there's more evidence in that space. And even then, there's really not a lot to make strong recommendations. Most of the, unfortunately, and it's not the fault of the scientists, but there's restrictions on how you can give probiotics and in these studies. But most of the studies are small, or they're actually done in individuals who are well. And so it's really difficult to say, if you don't have depression and you give somebody a probiotic and they feel better, is this a good probiotic for depression? Because they didn't really have depression to start with. So all of that to be said, that most of the probiotics that are currently on the market are lactobacillus. They've all been shown to be pretty safe. I would say they probably play more of a role in prevention than treatment. And so what they do seem to be helpful for some people is, if they can get well, they can be part of helping them stay well. They can be part of helping prevent something from getting worse. And so any conventional probiotic is probably as good as any other at this point. I think what people refer to as functional foods, and so, or superfoods, so super high fiber foods like kombucha, sauerkraut, those types of high fiber foods are probably even better than a probiotic if you can add those things in a diet.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, in a world of big money marketing, how do you choose an effective pre-stroke probiotic?
And again, they're pretty much all the same. And so I would say, I would say 80% of them, if you go to a drugstore. And so first of all, I would say try to get one that's approved and regulated, because some of the things that you look for is something called CTUs, or colony forming units. So probiotics are less about milligrams, like 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams, more about how many colonies of bacteria in there. And so you want to look for something that has kind of more than the power of 9 behind it. That means that there's a lot in them. So, that's something to look for. Make sure that it is something that has been vetted. Less so in Canada, but in the US, you can get fecal transplant in strip malls. You can get homemade probiotics in strip malls. Not surprisingly, and I really try to say to people, it is the equivalent of saying you're going to show up and get a blood transfusion in a strip mall from a place in which they don't talk about any screening. People can die. And unfortunately, people have died. And so it's really important that you get it from a place that is regulated. And so, that can be, it doesn't necessarily have to be a drugstore. Obviously, we know that those things are a bit more regulated. If you have a natural healthcare practitioner that are selling compounds that you have gone through Health Canada or FDA, any of those are fine. So talk to somebody that you trust. Don't buy them at a stall in a farmer's market.
What do you think is the financial implication on the companies that currently make pre and probiotics with fecal transplantation?
Sorry, can you what?
So do you think you're going to push the companies who are currently making pre and probiotics out of business?
So that's interesting. I think they're very different. So pre and probiotics are quite safe. I think for many people, if you're able to really have a balanced diet, they probably are going to be less important. They are more like vitamins, and again, we heard about vitamin D and other vitamins and the importance of these things in treatment. They're part of that. They're not actually meant to change the bacteria that are in your gut. Fecal transplant is a little bit different. It's actually meant to change your gut bacteria, so that's why pre and probiotics will be considered a natural health product. Fecal transplant is actually considered a therapeutic. And so it's regulated by the same group that regulates drugs. Probiotics, there's pre and probiotics are probably never going to do anything bad. There are for sure, especially if you don't know where you're getting the source from, there are potential harms that can come from fecal transplant. It's really important that people make sure that fecal transplant's been properly processed and screened. During COVID, all fecal transplant got stopped because you had to show you were screening the donors for COVID, because you could actually contract COVID during via fecal transplant. So there's always new stuff coming up. So they play completely different roles. So I don't think one's ever gonna, and fecal transplant's hard to find, whereas probiotics are easier to find. So I don't think they're ever gonna be, one's gonna replace the other. They have different uses and different indications.
Thank you. Okay, so is there a link with chronic constipation, SIBO, and PANS?
Ooh, that's a, I don't know. So what I can say is that there was, part of the reason they did fecal transplant in autism was because chronic constipation was part of the illness pathology. Now, is that in part due to the restrictive eating? And so what comes first? There's a super restrictive eating that causes the constipation. That makes the symptoms worse, because then you're changing your gut bacteria. Does the gut bacteria change first with chronic constipation, and then that makes the PANS PANDAS symptoms different? I don't know. I also do know that I don't know if people are familiar with something called the ketogenic diet, if that's ever come up, and certainly that is the ketogenic diet, which really, is a specific sort of protein-rich diet that causes the production of ketones, is used in the treatment of autism. It's been shown to be helpful. It's used in the treatment of some neurological conditions, like certain types of epilepsies, and there's actually a study that's going to start soon looking at it for treatment in bipolar disorder. So certainly I think that diet constipation piece is linked. SIBO's an interesting one, and it gets a bit tricky. So for us, unfortunately, right now in our studies, we are excluding SIBO, because we know that, just like we exclude Crohn's and colitis, because we want to test our products in an individual who has a healthy gut. And we know Crohn's colitis, you don't have a healthy gut. SIBO, you also don't have a healthy gut. So we do hope, as the work expands, that we're actually going to be able to look at these specific different types of populations, because the other thing we know is that there's higher rates of mental illness in individuals who have GI problems like Crohn's, colitis, and even SIBO, and especially anxiety disorders. So there for sure is a link. How we tease that apart, I don't think the field's there yet.
Thank you. So my panda's child immediately goes into a flare, i.e. within 24 to 48 hours, as soon as we give them a probiotic. How might this be explained?
Oh, so sorry, I missed my apologies.
So my panda's child immediately goes into a flare once they're given a probiotic.
That's so interesting, and I've read a little bit about that. The question was that they have a flare whenever they receive a probiotic. And so I would say, as an analogy, there are certain antidepressants that increase serotonin, because that's often thought to be associated with depression, is not enough serotonin. There's one antidepressant that doesn't increase serotonin at all. It actually doesn't touch serotonin, and it increases dopamine and norepinephrine. And so if you have a depression where the problem is you don't have enough serotonin and you take this drug, you're immediately going to feel worse, because all of a sudden it's making that difference between serotonin and the other neurotransmitters way worse. And so there's no one magic profile for, the gut microbiome for PANDAS, for example. And so if your child has a microbiome profile that there's already too much lactobacillus, and then you give a probiotic that is designed to increase lactobacillus, you're going to make things worse and not better. And so I think that that's why it's really important to do trial and error. And then I would say have a look at the specific probiotic. There is the 90% of the studies done on probiotics are done on lactobacillus. There's one study that looked at a probiotic that came out of Japan, and it was a Clostridium probiotics. Harder to find, but you can find it. So just have a look at the drugstores at what the different probiotics are made of. That is actually the probiotic for which they saw the best results for depression. So maybe, they're all different. The bacteria are very different, and we know that different bacteria do different things. And so it may be that you have to be a bit more specific with the probiotic, or it may be that there is no good probiotic currently available right now for the particular gut dysbiosis that your child has. And so I would say then it's probably not less of a good idea, and you might want to look at other things. So other than probiotics, there's things called prebiotics or postbiotics, which are not actually bacteria. They're either part of capsules or they contain food that good or healthy gut bacteria like to eat, so that you're actually kind of directly feeding the good bacteria. So start to play around with those types of things, and that may be a better option.
Okay, great, thank you. 3 more minutes, so you're nearly there. You're doing really well.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Is it not possible to formulate the same combination of bacteria that are in the capsules?
Well, and so that's exactly what we've tried to do. So that is what we did, was we took the capsules, which are fecal transplant, which are kind of, have that big chunk of the trillion bacteria that you have in it. We looked at the bacteria of people who are sick. We looked at when they took the capsules, what did their bacteria look like when they got well? We looked at the bacteria, I know the capsules, I know. We looked at the bacteria that were in our donors who didn't get on well. We looked at people who took the capsules and didn't improve and what happened to their bacteria. And then people with much more expensive toys than I have access to did a lot of really complicated work to identify for them the 18 bacteria that they thought were associated with, in the case of, the area we're furthest along, bipolar depression. And so we have this 18 bacteria that we then grew, are in the process of growing and packaging together, that we're then going to test. And I would say when we get to the point that we're doing that for OCD, we're probably going to find that there's probably about maybe 50% of the bacteria for bipolar disorder are probably the same ones that we're going to find in OCD, but there's then going to be that 50% that are unique for OCD. And for our bipolar stuff, all 18 bacteria, aside from one of them, none of them are commercially available in a probiotic right now. So they're all completely novel, but all of them have scientific literature to explain that they are actually been seen to have a role in depression. I bet you we're going to find the same thing for OCD. And so that is exactly what we're trying to do, is to take the bacteria from fecal transplant, kind of grow it up so you actually have a supercharged pill that is specific for the things that we think are going to be associated with wellness, that we're now going to hopefully by the end of this year be able to start testing.
Amazing. Okay, and the final question is from a healthcare practitioner. Have you seen evidence of probiotics making psychiatric symptoms worse? And there's a second part to that question, which is about when to advise patients to introduce the probiotic, i.e. which stage of treatment.
Yeah, and so I think the first part of that question was already answered by another person in the audience. So absolutely, I think that sometimes depending on sort of because we know it's not about ratios, it's not about, other than, when you have, so with PANDAS is a bit unique in that we think it's one specific bacteria that at least starts things, but for the most part, it's about proportions, and you have to have this and this sort of balancing, and that this balance can be off in a myriad of different ways, and people can get unwell. And so if a probiotic makes that balance worse instead of better, absolutely that the symptoms are going to get worse. Again, when should you start? I don't think there's a specific wrong time. I think in our experience, probiotics are better at helping people stay well. There's a little bit, and I showed you that OCD slide, there's some evidence to show that if people are looking at the use of probiotics, if you have to use long-term antibiotics, so that you know that you're adding back in some of the helpful bacteria and not just eradicating everything, because there's also some work to show that long-term antibiotic use can actually worsen inflammation. So I think that, I wish I had more specific guidelines to tell you, but I think it's more trial and error, but some of those pieces are what the literature says might be helpful. So, I think in terms of specifics, that is what the literature says. I don't think there's any kind of good advice, and it is a bit of trial and error.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you.